The psychology of a child who grew up feeling invisible. The hidden pain of erased identity. The child who learned to survive by disappearing. This archetype represents the soul that equates visibility with danger. The person who learned early that attention brought correction, not connection, that silence was safer than expression. They became experts at being fine, masters of invisibility, protectors of the peace at the cost of their presence. Part 1. The High-Impact Hook and Core Paradox. You learned very early that being seen came with a cost. Maybe it was the look on your parents' face when you spoke too loudly. Maybe it was the way they sighed, not out of cruelty, but exhaustion, when you needed comfort. Or maybe it wasn't anything they said at all. It was what they didn't say. The silence after your small triumphs. The empty space where celebration should have been. So, you adapted. You learned to blend in, to predict what others wanted before they asked. You learned to disappear just enough so you wouldn't be a problem. And you told yourself, I'm okay like this. I don't need much. But that wasn't the truth. That was survival. Because what saved you as a child, your ability to make yourself small, is now the very thing that keeps you trapped as an adult. You built an identity around not needing attention, around self-sufficiency, around silence. But invisibility, when practiced long enough, becomes a prison. You became the one who listens deeply, who understands everyone, yet feels deeply misunderstood. You became the one everyone leans on, yet you feel like no one ever truly sees you. That's the paradox. Your invisibility protected you once, but now it starves you. It kept you safe, but it's also why you can't fully live. Part 2. Definition and Psychological Authority. In psychology, this experience often traces back to what's called emotional neglect. Not the presence of harm, but the absence of attunement. Your physical needs may have been met, but your inner world, your feelings, your dreams, your fears, went unseen, unacknowledged. Children who grow up in emotionally neglectful environments often develop a defense mechanism known as self-erasure, the chronic minimizing of one's emotional presence to avoid rejection or burdening others. Neurologically, this process affects what's known as the default mode network, the part of the brain that constructs the sense of self. When a child repeatedly suppresses emotional expression, their self-referential processing becomes blunted. In other words, the brain learns not to think of itself as significant. You stop existing at the center of your own story. Another psychological concept relevant here is attachment avoidance. When caregivers consistently fail to meet emotional needs, the child internalizes the belief that connection is unsafe or unreliable. So they detach, not out of strength, but necessity. They become hyper-independent, allergic to need, convinced that self-containment equals maturity. And then there's fawning, a lesser-known trauma response, often mistaken for kindness. It's the instinct to placate, to people-please, to keep everyone calm so you won't be abandoned. The invisible child often becomes the adult who feels compelled to manage everyone else's emotional temperature, while quietly ignoring their own. So, the psychology of invisibility is not about weakness. It's about adaptation. The nervous system learns, if I'm quiet, they stay. If I'm helpful, they approve. If I'm invisible, I'm safe. But safety and fulfillment are not the same thing. And what once regulated your environment now restricts your existence. Part 3. The emotional cost and philosophical weight. There's a specific kind of grief that belongs to the invisible ones. A grief that has no funeral, no name. It's the grief of the unlived self. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But for you, that privilege was delayed, because who you truly are was something you learned to hide. The emotional cost of invisibility is immense. It shows up as chronic loneliness, even in crowded rooms. It shows up as exhaustion from performing calmness. It shows up in the quiet despair of never feeling chosen, even when someone loves you. You begin to confuse invisibility with humility. You tell yourself that being unseen is noble, that asking for recognition is selfish. But underneath that narrative lies a trembling truth. You never learned what it felt like to matter. And so the invisible child becomes the adult who cannot rest. Rest feels foreign, because rest invites awareness, and awareness invites the ache of all those unmet needs. This is the hidden philosophy of their suffering. They didn't disappear because they wanted to. They disappeared because they believed it was the only way to stay loved. Every time they swallow a truth, every time they apologize for existing, every time they hide their brilliance so others won't feel small, they're repeating an ancient bargain made in childhood. If I make myself small enough, maybe I'll finally be safe. But the soul knows better, because no amount of shrinking ever satisfies the hunger to be seen. Part 4. Adult Manifestation and the Unlearning. So how does this archetype play out in adulthood? You might recognize yourself in these patterns. In relationships, you become the caretaker, the listener, the emotional anchor. You attract partners who take and rarely give. You hesitate to express needs because you fear being too much. Love becomes a performance of patience, not mutual recognition. At work, you overperform, but under-advocate. You're the quiet backbone of every project, the reliable one. But promotions pass you by because you've trained others to overlook your presence. In friendships, you become the safe space for others, the one they call at midnight to confess their fears. Yet when you need support, you tell yourself, they're probably busy. In boundaries, you say yes out of guilt, not desire. You equate saying no with rejection, so you give until you resent. In self-perception, you struggle with imposter syndrome because your identity was never mirrored back to you. You don't feel real unless someone else confirms it. In inner life, you find it difficult to feel joy without guilt. You may even sabotage moments of recognition because being seen feels unsafe, like breaking an ancient rule. But here's the truth. These are coping strategies, not your personality. You are not inherently selfless. You were trained to be invisible. You are not naturally quiet. You were conditioned to avoid punishment. You are not bad at asking for help. You were taught that your needs were irrelevant. The unlearning begins when you stop gaslighting yourself about what happened. When you stop saying, "It wasn't that bad." When you begin to witness your own story with compassion, as though you were finally parenting the child you once were. Healing begins not with changing your behavior, but by witnessing your own absence, by noticing how often you step out of the frame of your own life. Part 5. The Healing, Conclusion, and Affirmation. Healing the invisible self is not about becoming loud. It's about becoming known. It begins with small acts of rebellion, saying how you actually feel, taking up space without apologizing, allowing someone to see your tears without shame. Psychologically, this process is called reparenting, giving yourself now what you were denied then: attunement, validation, and safety in expression. Through shadow work, you confront the parts of you that learn to hide. You meet your anger, your desire, your need for attention, not as flaws, but as fragments of your humanity that were exiled for survival. Over time, your nervous system learns that visibility is not death, it's life. That being seen doesn't always end in shame. Sometimes it ends in connection. The poet David Whyte once wrote, "The antidote to exhaustion is not rest, it's wholeheartedness." To heal from invisibility is to reclaim your wholeness, to stand in the full light of your being, even if it feels unnatural at first. You were never meant to be a background character in your own story. Your quietness is not a flaw, it's a language. But now, it's time for that language to be heard. Because when you allow yourself to be seen, truly seen, you give permission for others to do the same. So if you grew up feeling invisible, remember this: your presence was never the problem. It was their blindness that taught you to hide. You are not meant to disappear. You are meant to exist, fully, vividly, unapologetically. And that is the beginning of being seen. If this resonated with you, consider sharing it. Someone else might still be disappearing, waiting to be found.